Welcome to Press TV's News Review. In this segment, we put more focus on some of the top stories of the day. Stick around. In this news review, we focus on Europe. The European Union sources say that the UK is pushing to block an EU plan to include Saudi Arabia on a blacklist of countries that pose money laundering and terrorism financing threats. The sources say other EU heavyweights, including Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, are towing Britain's line. European officials say Riyadh is lobbying against the move and has threatened to cancel lucrative contracts in some EU nations. The officials, however, say that the EU Commission that has adopted the draft list will not bow to pressure. The Commission says it will approve the list in the coming weeks. There are also more than 20 other territories on the list that are included over alleged failures to fight illicit cash flows. And joining us now on this edition of Press TV's News Review, we have our correspondent Tamina Taylor joining us from the British capital, London, and also publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, also joining us from London. Let's start off with you, Amina. Tell us more about the UK's efforts to block EU's plans on including Saudi Arabia on that blacklist.
Well, if anybody had followed this story very closely, and indeed even from a distance, you would know that it's no surprise that the countries that are lobbying the hardest for Riyadh not to be included on a list that I think is quite obvious for them to be included on would be those countries who benefit the most from their trading abilities with Riyadh. Now, just last year, we had a High Court case brought by Campaign Against the Arms Trade to talk about Saudi involvement in the war on Yemen. And then if we fast forward to October the 2nd of this year and the Jamal Khashoggi case and the barbarity that was actually exposed there, that was, according to the CIA's own files, perpetrated by the Crown Prince and his allies, how would this country escape the very basic definition of being a rogue state and a state that actually sponsors terrorism? It totally defies logic, and it blows bare the hypocritical nature of what the United Kingdom purports to be about. Because on one hand, you're saying, essentially, if you're an ally and we can make money from you, then you have carte blanche to commit human rights abuses as you see fit. And that's exactly what Riyadh is counting on as it lobbies behind the scene to ensure its name is not added to a list that, quite frankly, has countries that shouldn't be on there and also has countries that need to be added there.
Mr. Papadopoulos, your thoughts on the issue? Do you agree with Amina? She says that it's both perplexing and also hypocritical of the stance that UK is taking, along with some other European countries as well.
I concur entirely with your correspondent's assessment. In terms of extremism and terrorism, Saudi Arabia is the leading financier and exporter of this to the world. And in terms of human rights, the Saudi state is the most barbaric in the world. Yet, despite that, Britain has an extremely close strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. Indeed, London is not just an ally to Saudi Arabia, London is a friend to Saudi Arabia. So when the British government argues that it is a beacon for human rights in the world, that it is a invaluable country for fighting terrorism in the world, we can say clearly that these are just empty words from London. Because if the British government sincerely cared about human rights abuses, then they wouldn't have such a close relationship with Saudi Arabia. And if the British government was intent on truly combating extremism and terrorism in the world, then once again, Britain would not have such an intimate relationship with the Saudis.
Mr. Papadopoulos, when we look at all the human rights infringements that Riyadh is carrying out both internally And externally, we have to look at what happens inside the kingdom, and then we have to turn our attention to the war on Yemen. Let's not forget the murdering of the dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The United States and its allies, most notably the UK, they're quite selective when it comes to the issue of human rights, and it seems they also have a price tag for it as well.
The argument that Britain is genuinely committed to human rights is simply untenable. Conversely, the argument that Britain is selective when it comes to human rights is an irrefutable one. If we're talking about inside Saudi Arabia, then some of the human rights abuses that the Saudi state is guilty of is simply stomach-turning. Not only do they behead people, but they crucify people. They gouge people's eyes out. I mean, you wouldn't really think that such horrendous behavior would happen in the 21st century. And if we're talking about in the context of international affairs, well, Saudi Arabia carries out wicked, horrendous, diabolical, savage attacks against civilians, including children, in Yemen. In Syria, the Saudis played a crucial role in sending psychopathic terrorist killers to Syria to terrorize the Syrian population. These are just examples of what the Saudi state does at home and abroad. And the fact that the British are now lobbying hard, lobbying strenuously for Saudi Arabia not to be blacklisted really is a dreadful indictment of Britain, and one, as I said, totally and utterly undermines the British state's argument that it cares for human rights and that it is fighting terrorism in the world.
Publisher and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you for your comments, and also thanks to our correspondent, Tamina Taylor, joining us from London. And with that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of Press TV's News Review. Stay tuned, we've got plenty more to come.